to this event on Europe's role in Sino-US strategic competition in the tech sector. We will talk about the tech sector today because it has become an arena for fierce US-China strategic competition, which challenges Europe's ability to play a leading role in the economic, industrial, security, and military sectors. Europe's future economic growth and its innovation capability and its warfighting capability is determined by its access to cutting-edge cellular network infrastructure and to artificial intelligence applications. However, Europe's weak position in the global technology market leaves it at a disadvantage in terms of things such as standard setting and competitiveness. Transatlantic agreement that protective measures are necessary against China's approach to digital infrastructure and artificial intelligence is growing, but at the same time, Europe's tech sovereignty agenda contributes to enhanced transatlantic tensions. Today, we will discuss if Europe has the innovative industrial basis and the big companies that are needed to develop an autonomous cellular network, artificial intelligence solutions, and so on. And we will also address if Europe will focus on digital cooperation within the Union, or if Europe will look to other powers to ensure that Europe remains at the forefront of technological developments. And today with us, we have three distinguished speakers to debate these issues. We have Mathieu Duchâtel, which is the director of the Asia program at Institut Montaigne in Paris. We have Giulio Pugliese, who's a lecturer at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies at the University of Oxford, and a part-time professor in the Global Governance program in the EU Asia project at the European University Institute in Florence. And we also have Thomas J. Duesterberg, who's a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, and he's also a former assistant secretary for international economic policy at the US Department of Commerce. I am Liselotte Odgaard. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, and I will moderate today's discussion. And I will start with you, Mathieu. We will start with semiconductors, which forms the center of any digital system. And it's also at the heart of the US tech industry. And the semiconductor industry has been in the spotlight because there has been a shortage of supplies, not just because of the pandemic, but also very much because of the US-China tech war. Can you explain to us what role do these semiconductors play in the strategic competition, and where does it leave Europe?
Thank you, Liselotte, and thanks for having me. And starting with semiconductors actually does make sense, not only because they are in the spotlight as a result of the current shortages of supply, especially for the automotive industry, which affects Europe, the US, and China as well. I think semiconductors have been at the very center of the US-China tech war since the US, under the Trump administration, decided to hit the company Huawei at their key vulnerability, which is their need for foreign semiconductor technology, not only semiconductors as final products, processors for their smartphones and base stations, but also semiconductor technology. You know, seen from Europe, Europe is really caught between two different forces. On the one hand, you have very powerful Chinese industrial policies to reduce China's supply chain vulnerabilities, as they have been uncovered during the Huawei, let's call it the Huawei crisis. And in fact, we have the numbers for 2020 now. China has imported 380 billion US dollars of semiconductor last year, which is more than oil. But China's problem is about catching up and moving to the cutting edge of semiconductor design, but also foundry processes, and to catch up in developing its own intellectual property for semiconductor technology. And China, since 2015, and you have there the signature of Xi Jinping, speaks of its ambitions of becoming a leader for the semiconductor industry. Today, China only produces 15% of what it consumes, but has goals to reach 70% by 2025. So on the other hand, you have increasingly restrictive US policies on technology transfers started by the Trump administration, initially focusing on Huawei, but in fact expanding to China's access to semiconductor technology in general, with an extraterritorial dimension. And in fact, the Huawei restrictions have hit a number of actors in the European semiconductor industry and had an impact on their revenue since they could no longer export to Huawei. And the game is in fact becoming more complex as the US under the Biden administration, but this was started by the Trump administration actually, is moving to reduce supply chain vulnerabilities for the US and is in reality adopting an industrial policy, you could call it like that, to boost the US manufacturing of semiconductor. And the great example, the best one, is the invitation to TSMC, the leading Taiwanese contract foundry, to set up a fab in Arizona. So for Europe, what does it mean? I think that this creates immediate issues of protection from intangible tech transfers as a result of Chinese industrial policies. China needs to catch up. It needs access to semiconductor technology from wherever it comes from. And Europe has R&D, excellent R&D for semiconductor technology. It has also a number of startups. It has a number of relatively big actors, not leaders for foundries, but it has key strengths in design. So there is an immediate issue of beefing up the defensive toolbox to make sure intangible tech transfers are well managed as an issue for Europe. I think the second issue it creates for Europe is how far Europe will be willing to go in coordinating with the United States on tech transfers control. I think it's really an issue that is very, very central as we are speaking now, and as the policy of the Biden administration is shaping up on the issue. I think at this stage in Europe, there is awareness that what is really at stake with the semiconductor industry is the long-term competitiveness of Europe as we are undergoing a digital transformation that affects our economies and our societies. Europe has some strengths in the supply chain. I think an excellent example is extreme ultraviolet lithography, which is an essential component. It's basically choke point technology for advanced semiconductor foundry capacity, and it's a Dutch company that has basically a monopoly over that technology. I mean, it's one example, it's perhaps the only example for a monopoly, but it's one example of the niche key strengths that the European industry has. And I think at the minimum, Europe has to cultivate its strengths with its policy tools, in particular support for research and development, but also, again, the tech transfer control issue is important. But the big issue, in fact, is the one that has been started by the example of the United States. It's the question of, do we need advanced foundry capacity in Europe? And this discussion has started 20 years ago in the US and has found a conclusion last year. I think the discussion is only starting now in Europe. And this is really an important one for the future of Europe.
Thank you, Mathieu. That was very enlightening. I will move on to Giulio. Mathieu talked a lot about, the industrial opportunities there are in Europe, but Europe's response to the US-China dispute over Huawei is often said to illustrate Europe's vulnerabilities and indecisions in the tech war, at least at the political level, that can, prevent Europe from having the kind of the response it really needs. How would you characterize Europe's response and its potential for handling this issue?
Thanks for having me, Lisa. I think the answer is necessarily going to be simplified because what Europe has undergone in terms of dealing with the Huawei and really ZTE, also Chinese 5G hardware component providers, has been a process really of path dependency, fragmentation, and of a growing, swift, rapidly shifting and moving environment. And I'll qualify my answer in a second. 5G is very different from its predecessors, such as 4G. And it's a high risk, high gain telecommunication technology because it essentially will be the backbone of what we call the fourth industrial revolution. It is going to be the backbone of smart cities, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, the consumption and production of data. And once the rollout is completed, we will see an incredible amount of data produced and consumed over these networks. But the components, the 5G components, are produced by suppliers such as Huawei through, of course, they produce antennas, base stations and racks, but they're also in charge of maintaining them. So that's the reason why I use quotation marks for hardware. It is increasingly important to look at the software that keeps an eye, that maintains and runs this hardware. And so we essentially have to entrust the suppliers, the vendors such as Huawei, with the data privacy and also with keeping up with our national interests. Now, the reason why I talked about path dependency is that this wasn't the case for 4G. And many important European countries, such as Italy and Germany, for instance, have a large majority of their 4G infrastructure based on Chinese vendors, such as Huawei and ZTE. Italy, for instance, has 53% of its 4G network based on these two important Chinese players. Now, if you take into consideration the economic component of 5G, the economic competitiveness that 5G allows, it makes perfect sense in terms of cost-benefit analysis to implant then and roll out 5G on the pre-existing 4G network. And it would be an enormous cost to rip them off because, of course, it is much easier not to have standalone 5G technology. And built up on pre-existing base stations, antennas, and whatnot. Now, the problem is that, of course, this has changed. The environment has shifted rapidly because of China's growing assertiveness, because of what Mathieu was talking about in terms of China's increased use and abuse of its asymmetric capabilities vis-a-vis others, in terms of economic capabilities, also for political gains, but also of its authoritarian evolution. Of course, there's also been national intelligence laws that mandate civilian actors and private companies to collaborate with the party state regime. And the other problem has been, of course, the fact that Italy, for instance, and Germany and other countries have been between two fires, has been essentially the fact that what Mathieu was talking about when he was referring to US export controls, and really the willingness to weaken global champions such as Huawei to avoid that they become predominant players. This essentially would also imply a risk in terms of the substandard products, Chinese products, and lack of supplies for the 5G network. Because if we don't have American technology and semiconductors in the incoming 5G networks, then it is clear that there is also a security risk, even absent a Chinese threat, so to speak. And so what has happened is that the European Union has developed a 5G toolbox that has essentially gone hand in hand with foreign investment screening mechanisms at the national level, but also in a much more sort of course, watered down way at the European Union level, to assess the risks associated with so-called high-risk vendors. And these risks are not just related to China per se, but also to the supply chain capacity that high-risk vendors would have. For instance, getting key technology from the rest of the world. And so to that extent, we are seeing now more and more diminishing reliance on Chinese technology in the 5G networks. But again, I think that this is path dependency, really, and it's the environment that has changed. And what we will see more and more now is coming to terms with this shifting strategic and economic and geopolitical environment to square the circle.
Thank you, Giulio. I will now turn to Tom, because there is also a transatlantic component to this. The United States and China look set to remain fierce tech competitors under US President Biden. But do you think there are opportunities for strengthened transatlantic cooperation in the tech war? And if there are, what needs to happen to realize this potential, in your opinion?
Okay, well, short answer is I do think there are areas for cooperation if both sides, and here I'm including US and Europe, if both sides have the political will to do that. But let me just try to put this in a little bit broader context for starters. I'll just assert from the start that China has already made the decision a long time ago to move towards a form of autarky. I mean, we have the Made in China 2025 program, which has been alluded to. We have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is exporting to build an ecosystem controlled by China. And now it wants to have its own standards making body in Asia, which would be dominated by China. So you mentioned the Biden administration is probably going to continue, and it's fairly clear that it's going to continue to be aggressive in trying to meet the China challenge, as I would call it. But it's also moving very quickly into an area of very robust industrial policy, as both previous speakers mentioned. We're going to have to see how much of the really ambitious industrial policy the Biden administration has put on the table can make it through the political process in the United States. I would note this is much broader than just semiconductors and 5G. It's green technology, for instance. Now, I also note that the European Union, Europe has long favored national champions in building some autonomy. The current term of art seems to be protecting European sovereignty through resilience of the industrial sector. And even Europe now is talking of a much broader set of initiatives under this rubric of resiliency, self-sufficiency, or sovereignty. It's notable that on December the 7th, which is an interesting date, 2020, there was an agreement by the telecom ministers to use, to try to acquire about $175 billion worth of the COVID relief reindustrialization fund within Europe for 5G systems. But also Europe is also talking about building its own semiconductor, cloud computing, medical equipment, vaccine industries as well. Now, to me, all this is reminiscent of the distant policies of the 1930s and perhaps much earlier in Germany, Italy, France, and the UK from the late 19th century, where there's a risk of sort of a competitive industrial policy, not only with China, but now with the United States. And the United States is going to have to make a decision about how much it wants to try, as it professes to want to do, to cooperate with allies. Japan is fairly much on board, I think, with especially the technology sector, but Europe seems to be going in the direction of strategic autonomy. Now, I would prefer to find areas of cooperation as the political situation permits and leadership could promote, working with trusted allies. And again, I emphasize Japan and other like-minded countries. The United States is deeply involved in this program they call the Free and Open Pacific, which Prime Minister Abe really pioneered, but which is trying to even entice India to join, to work together. Now, some of the promising areas for cooperation, I mean, we have gone over 5G systems. I would note that unlike the suggestion that Mathieu made in his paper on the semiconductor industry, the US policy is not necessarily just promoting US providers. I mean, the battle against Huawei, the principal beneficiaries, of course, are Ericsson and Nokia, at least so far. But I would also note that there is some promising different technologies, notably the virtualized networks or Open RAN systems, which are being tested in Germany, UK, Japan, and the United States. And I will also note that you don't have to rip out the previous systems to implement virtualized networks. There are systems integrators in the United States, Parallel Wireless, Altiostar, Mavenir, all of whom claim to be able to have backward compatibility with 4G and even 3G systems. This needs to be tested and perfected, but that ought to be an area where there's contributions from both European, US, Japanese suppliers. Semiconductors, again, this is key to much of the industries of the future, and we do have a dangerous dependence on China for raw materials such as rare earths and the materials that go into batteries and end markets. US, Europe are really the leaders in design and fabrication technologies and the equipment that goes into this. Of course, Taiwan is and Samsung are the leaders in the fabrication arena. The United States seems to be wanting to go down the track of both enticing Samsung and TSMC to come to the United States, but also to build up our own indigenous fabrication plants. And really the most robust industrial policy initiative, which has bipartisan support in the United States, is putting up to 50 billion or more into the fabrication plants in the United States at the leading edge. Now, I would also note there was an interesting study put out by the Semiconductor Industry Association done by the Boston Consulting Group, put out earlier this month, which takes the unusual step of trying to estimate how much it would cost if the United States and Europe, East Asia for that matter, were to try to have their more or less self-sufficient ecosystems for semiconductors. And the cost they came up with for Europe to become self-sufficient is a capital investment over 3 years of between $240 and $330 billion. In the United States, it's higher, 350 to 420. But I question whether or not either side really wants to do that, spend that money. It would not be economically efficient. It would put barriers between traditional allies and just goad China into further efforts to build their own independent ecosystems. Now, there are other areas related to technology that we ought to cooperate on too. The mining and processing of the raw materials needed for the technology, rare earths, gallium is increasingly important in the semiconductor industry, battery materials. I mean, why not cooperate with both miners in friendly countries like Australia, Canada, even South America, but processing technology shared between Europe and the United States, and that ought to be an area that would be easy to try to eliminate some dependence on China for these materials. I think both sides also should increase basic and applied research in key areas to maintain the current leads in technology. United States is likely, I think, to double federal support for basic research and focus more on high-tech and manufacturing arenas now contested by China. Collaborative research should be encouraged where both sides have different segments of specialization. Again, I repeat, Open RAN projects, which Germany has just put $2 billion into, and Italy is participating in, by the way, seems to envision some US collaborators with significant presence already in Europe. Now, finally, I'd note that I think there's an urgent need not to undo the progress of previous years in the so-called trilateral dialogue on WTO reform. This is US, Japan, and the EU, focused initially on state subsidization, which of course is one of the major problems with working with China. The Biden team has signaled more openness to working with Europe in this arena, but Europe, I think, needs to seize the opportunity and not ruin it with a drive to support national champions. US, I repeat, is moving, I think, too quickly towards some sort of unfettered and very broad industrial policy, not just in high tech, but in green tech as well, where Europe, let's face it, has a competitive edge. So reaching out on both sides would be beneficial, both economically and politically. Europe does not have to definitively choose sides, but working with the US and others to curb Chinese mercantilism would be advantageous to the so-called rules-based international order, which is the traditional, Europe claims to be the guarantor of that liberal system. So let me stop my too long remarks there.
Thanks, Tom. I'll turn to Mathieu because Tom had some pretty significant views on semiconductors and 5G and the possibilities for Europe to play a role there and for transatlantic cooperation. Would you like to respond to some of Tom's remarks?
Of course, yes. There's much to say in reaction. I mean, first on, I would have a slight difference on the particular point you made regarding Europe supporting its national champions. I would see it a little bit differently. And again, starting with the example of semiconductors, because this is an issue that is moving and in fact, it tests the capacity of states to come up with solutions. Currently, as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, the EU has adopted its recovery plan, which includes 20% of the total funding to support the digital transformation of Europe. This is about, if I'm correct, 135 billion euros that will be basically given to the national member states, because it's actually split into 27 member states. The member states come up with plans that have to be approved by the Commission. If you look at what is going to be approved, it's very clear that there is this very strong tendency of the European Commission to fund innovative research and development specific projects put up by companies rather than manufacturing capacities. And when I hear about the US plan to fund the implementation in the US of TSMC, or the 50 billion US dollars that could go to supporting foundry capacity in the United States, that's not something that the EU has the policy instruments to pull off. And another example, another instrument that the EU is using is the so-called important common project of European interests. Important project of common European interest. It's basically a funding envelope to support one specific industry. And there was one for microelectronics. There's one for electric batteries, for electric vehicles. And if you look at the contents, and if you compare the policy tool to the tools that are used by the United States and China, it's very remarkable that it's also about supporting innovative research and development. So in fact, the EU is doing what it can with its policy instruments to support the digital transformation of Europe, but the policy instruments are quite weak when it comes to really supporting the implantation in Europe of manufacturing capacities. Maybe that's an issue of past dependency, but I think at the minimum, it's an issue of major political debate or expert debate at the moment in Europe. Can we move to something that is geared towards R&D, to something that is more supportive of industrial capacities? The other example is Ericsson and Nokia. When the debate on 5G infrastructure was raging in the EU about two years ago, one of the arguments was, why don't we just choose our own European national champions? As Giulio said, there is an issue of past dependency, given that Huawei has 30% of the 4G infrastructure market in Europe, and it's costly to change gear. But it's not only that. I think there's also a principled reject by the European Union to just support national champions. I think that's where we are in terms of debate regarding industrial champions. But let me say a few things regarding transatlantic cooperation. I mentioned, some of the distrust I have detected doing interviews in the semiconductor industry in Europe regarding the very specific case of Huawei, because after Huawei was listed on the entity list, a system of temporary general exemptions for export licenses was created by or adopted by the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce And so I think this created some distrust. This is one part of the equation. And I think that for the sake of transatlantic cooperation, this distrust needs to be addressed. And I think it's fairly easy to address now that a new administration is in place. This is about clarity on the licensing process. But that's the very specific case of Huawei's access to semiconductor technology. And this is about Huawei's former suppliers in Europe. I think the larger issue is about, convergence on tech transfers controls. And I think it's promising, but there are issues. I think it's more my role to talk about where I see, the potential problems arising as there are political forces pushing that cooperation agenda, both in the US and in Europe as well. I think the big question for Europe, as Europe has already overhauled its export control system for dual-use material, is whether we can move from a system that is focused on military end users and human rights violators, and on that there is still work to do. And I think the lists need to be joint lists, and identifying the end users is also something that requires cooperation. So there's some work to do on that, but can we follow the US in moving the export control focus from military end users and human rights violators to a tool of economic competitiveness? And I think that the US is moving in that direction. I feel that Japan has already been in that direction for a while. And I think that in Europe, there's a lot of principled, skepticism regarding that approach, because in the end, the mainstream is perhaps more liberal when it comes to that, and believes more in market forces. So I think that for the US and Europe to move in that direction, there will be work to be done, and this is in fact an urgent task.
Thank you, Mathieu. I want to turn to Giulio, because I would also like to hear your response to Tom's views on the prospects for transatlantic cooperation and Europe's potential to play a role in all this. He also had some views on the tech sovereignty agenda, which you might like to comment on.
Sure. So I think tech sovereignty agenda, or tech strategic autonomy, whatever we want to call it, digital sovereignty, falls pretty neatly in this conversation. And specifically because of what Mathieu has also said, and I very much agree with Mathieu's points. And I think that this applies also to the proposition that Thomas has made on joining hands on the virtualized open radio access network scenario that is essentially a more software-based, again, quote unquote, virtualized 5G network. But what is very interesting here, in my opinion, is that the technology is still well behind, in my opinion, and it's still far from being ready to be deployed as traditional hardware alternatives. And when we talk about hardware alternatives, of course, there's Huawei, but there's also Nokia and Ericsson. And what is left unsaid often with regards to the ORAN alliance, which is actually a close consortium between mobile network operators, as far as I understand, including Chinese ones, by the way, is that this will favor American industrial policy. And why is that so? Because the system is premised on software. And my understanding is that US strengths in the ICT sector are really software based. And so what we're seeing here is that through the National Defense Authorization Act that came along in January, specifically the Telecommunications Act, the US Telecommunications Act, and the subsidies that are going to be proposed by the US, we are seeing essentially a push along the lines that Mathieu was talking about, favoring essentially American strengths. And I think this is particularly interesting, and it's a bit of the European Union finding itself between two fires. So Huawei and ZTE, of course, are a problem. They are high-risk vendors, and there are the risks that we mentioned about earlier. But at the same time, the ORAN alternative is yet to come, and clearly is going to favor non-European industries from the looks of it. And so I see a tension there. And that's why, for instance, I was not sure about how to conclude my answer to your previous question earlier on, whether ORAN could have been a good solution to square the circle in terms of a 5G network that is secure and that is readily deployed to reap the gains of the so-called fourth industrial revolution. And let's not forget, but precisely because it's a software-based alternative, I think that there are also risks associated with those softwares that we need to take into account. I mean, if Chinese telecoms are also part of the alliance, how does that play into these risk management assessments? And so at the end of it, the technological autonomy or sovereignty agenda really boils down to the new industrial revolution, or the second digital revolution, taking place at a time of major technological upheaval, and not in a open, globalized economy anymore. And so what we are seeing is that we are seeing really, in my opinion, a scramble of all parties, the US, the European ones, but especially the US and China, for dominance in new important technologies. And I see that tension playing up at the economic level, and feeding into also the geopolitical frictions that are at play. And because of those very tensions, I'm a bit skeptical still of the factibility of the possibility of fully joining hands. For instance, on the ORAN alliance as an example.
Thanks, Giulio. In the interest of time, I want to turn now to Mathieu again and change the topic slightly to the military realm, because the strategic competition doesn't just influence industry, economic growth potential and all these, but also the military realm. Can you say a bit about how Europe's security and defense is affected by these developments in the technological realm?
Well, it's a very broad question that I will try to narrow down as much as I can. And again, let me start with semiconductors, because it's moving in that area, and I think it's a very revealing case of the geopolitical forces that are at play. When we discuss having an advanced foundry process in Europe, I think one argument that always comes against it is that you only need advanced foundry for basically advanced digital tools, meaning today high-end smartphones, base stations, servers. So it's basically the consumption economy for digital tools. So it's purely civilian. And that's really the argument that you hear in Europe today when debating this issue, that you don't really need an advanced foundry process when the manufacturers are all in the United States and in East Asia. But when you look at the American decision to create an advanced foundry process in the US to go below the level of 7 nanometers, in fact, there is an important element linked to the arms industry, which even though in value for the semiconductor industry only represents less than 1% of the total sales, but in terms of strategic value is in fact much more than that. So I think it's an interesting discussion to have with regards to industrial autonomy and just the competitiveness of the European arms industry looking forward in the next 20 years. So today, the most advanced weapons systems do not need the most advanced foundry processes. I think part of the American thinking regarding semiconductors, and clearly part of the Chinese thinking regarding the semiconductor industry, is that you need to think 20, 30 years ahead in terms of the possibilities for your research and development for your arms industry that will come with more advanced foundry processes. So when you think also in terms of the resilience of your supply chains, and obviously from a US perspective, the capacity to defend your supply chain from intrusions and sabotage by your strategic competitor, meaning China. I think this is an issue for any arms industry. As Europe is rethinking the common projects it can put together to maintain the competitiveness of its arms industry in the 21st century, to me, this is definitely an important element of that equation.
Thank you, Mathieu. I'll turn to Giulio now, because sometimes technological developments are said to help authoritarian regimes maintain control over people-born societies and that leaves democracies in a weaker position against these populist, authoritarian, and totalitarian propagators. How would you assess the influence of the technological developments on the strength of authoritarian regimes compared to democracies?
That is also a very big question, and I'm of the opinion that the technological prowess of authoritarian states really allows for the political involution and doubling down really of authoritarian tendencies, not least because it more capably monitors the potential unrest and legitimacy crisis that they may face. And so there is clearly a stark, you might say, defensive purpose from the point of view of the likes of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And I'm thinking of the social credit system, which can be leveraged, of course, and the digitalization of China and the smart cities, of course, they can be leveraged. The digital transformation as a whole can be leveraged for that very purpose. But I think what is fascinating, and I'll be very brief here, is the potential for that digitalization to harness also and mobilize private and civil actors for geopolitical or strategic goals. And this is part and parcel of the so-called military-civil fusion strategy. It has been around for quite a while. In 2015, it became a national strategy. And I had the good fortune yesterday of discussing at a panel at ISA, of discussing a paper by a Japanese China watcher, Chisako Masuo, who has led a joint paper focusing on the fishery regulation in favor of more sustainability and control of the fishing activities of China, and how essentially this went hand in hand with the introduction of new technologies, such as the Beidou navigation satellite system, which essentially provide for satellite navigation control from the local authorities and the central government, not just to monitor the vessels, but also to possibly mobilize them. And the conclusions of this study, which I find fascinating and very clear-eyed, are essentially suggesting that the Chinese government is now capable of mobilizing fishermen, private citizens, for essentially guerrilla activities of sorts. So you have the capacity to send fishing boats in disputed waters as part and parcel of so-called hybrid warfare. And this has been the case already in the past in China. In 1978, for instance, with Japan on the disputed Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. In 2016, again in the Senkaku Diaoyu, hundreds of fishing boats have been sent following the adjudication of the Scarborough Shoal and Philippines versus China dispute or Scarborough Shoal. And really China's expansive claims on the South China Sea. And this apparently is still actually worsening. And it's actually becoming easier for the party state regime to harness technology for so-called hybrid warfare, where essentially the state escalates tensions without necessarily reaching the point of aggression, and actually by invoking plausible or implausible deniability in this case, that is the deployment of civilians. And I think that this clearly is a strategic advantage that authoritarian governments such as Russia and China enjoy. Because of course, hybrid warfare is traditionally pushed by these two countries.
Thank you, Giulio. Tom, you've been waiting patiently, but you will get the last word. Do you want to comment on the implications for security, defense, and societal control of technological
Well, it's not necessarily
developments?
my area of expertise, but I have a few observations. I would start with noting that even though we all talk about the threat of China, and it's real, and the political ambitions of Xi Jinping are well documented, and he's now trying to implement them and throughout the China sphere, and we're going to have to make a political decision on how far we can go to counter that. I mean, for instance, just in the semiconductor area, a lot of the polysilicon that we use in the semiconductor industry comes from Xinjiang. What are we going to do about that? I mean, it's a very political decision. But I would step back a little bit and just make the observation that China is determined to move in a certain direction. A lot of this technology, artificial intelligence, 5G, 6G, can be employed, and the Chinese clearly want to employ it for building the surveillance state. But that being said, we shouldn't overemphasize China's lead in technology, because they don't have, in key areas, as Mathieu pointed out in his paper on semiconductors, they're very vulnerable. And the export control regime put in by the United States, has crippled Huawei's mobile phone business, their handset business. I think it was Mathieu also just in passing noted that Chinese aviation technology, jet engine technology is deficient. They've been putting huge amounts of money into that for decades. They've been stealing technology. They've been inducing, leading avionics firms from Europe and the United States to set up business there. Yet they can't succeed in building yet a competitive product. To me, I return to where I started. I think President Trump proved, amongst other things, that the United States, with a transactional philosophy, cannot go it alone and cause significant change of direction in China. Second, I would note that we are in the lead technologically, and we just need to be aggressive about the, if you will, the offensive side, which is bringing our basic research capabilities back up to what they were, for instance, in the heyday of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where the United States put over 1% of GDP into a single program of space exploration, at least for a few years. So again, it's politically difficult for myriad of reasons to take on China. I mean, they're going to react. They've proven lately that they will react very forcefully to European and American, Korean, Japanese suppliers in their country if they don't like what we're doing. We have to make an assessment of how far we are willing to push that. But we shouldn't forget that we have a technological lead, and Chinese economy still depends quite a bit on selling into our markets.
Thanks, Tom. And finally, just in one or two sentences, could you all answer the following question? If you look a decade ahead, how far do you think Europe will have gone down the route of autonomy in the tech sector? Mathieu?
It's a difficult one. I think that the issue is about ensuring that the gap does not widen too much. I'm slightly pessimistic when it comes to the policy tools that the European Union has created for itself. But of course, as I already mentioned previously, there are some key strengths, so the battle is not lost.
Thank you. And Giulio?
I am possibly even more pessimistic. We have still cultural, political barriers in Europe. We have a massive economic fallout resulting from the pandemic, where funds would be diverted elsewhere. We don't have a single capitals market. We have still a tension between the need to build global champions and then to preserve a singles liberal free market within the European Union and to ensure competitiveness. These are all factors we need to take into consideration.
Thank you. And finally, Tom?
Well, I can't add too much to what my European colleagues have diagnosed. I would just note that there's possibly, as you point out, Lisa, in your paper for the Schumann Center, still much of the economic policy is disaggregated in Europe. And that's a sort of politico-cultural issue that Europe still, after 70 years, has not overcome. So, and I'm somewhat skeptical that in the medium term that those issues of national versus European wide policy can be effectively resolved.
On that skeptical note, this completes the event. Thank you for listening.